The Galactic Council's premier battleship, the Magnificent Doctrine, was everything Jack Hollis never wanted to see again in his life. Gleaming corridors that somehow always smelled of ozone and superiority. Precisely regulated environmental systems that kept the temperature exactly wrong for human comfort. And most notably, a crew of 12 different alien species who regarded humans with the unique combination of fear and condescension usually reserved for a particularly unpredictable bomb. Human Hollis, your maintenance assignment begins in Environmental Control Sector 7, chirped Commander Flit, a bird-like being whose feather crest rose and fell with each syllable. Try not to break anything with those hands. The way he said hands made them sound like dangerous weapons rather than appendages. Jack nodded, keeping his face carefully neutral. Yes, Commander. And do refrain from sweating excessively. Your Deathworld secretions could trigger the bio-alarm systems. Jack bit his tongue. 6 months of this assignment remained. 6 long months. His file had been accidentally forwarded to the Galactic Council's Personnel Division by the Human Integration Program. Someone, somewhere had a sense of humor sending a human to the Council's most prestigious warship. Humans, Class 12 Deathworlders were supposedly valuable for their durability and strength, but primarily served on mining vessels and frontier stations where their unpredictable biology posed less risk. I understand the human requires several hours of unconsciousness each day cycle, remarked Science Officer T. Prell, her 8 eyes blinking in asynchronous patterns of disbelief. How inefficient. Inefficient. And consumes solid matter directly into its digestive tract, added Lieutenant Draz, shuddering his gelatinous form. Most primitive. Jack smiled tightly. I'll try to confine my barbaric eating to my quarters. See that you do. Commander Flit's crest flattened. Remember, Human Hollis, you are only here because the Council's diversity initiative requires representation from all allied species. Even the primitive ones, T. Prell added, unnecessarily. As Jack walked away toward his assignment, he heard Flit whisper loudly, keep your primary sensory organs on that one. Deathworlders are unpredictable. Its species only discovered interstellar travel 3 centuries ago. Jack didn't bother correcting them. Let them think what they wanted. The assignment would be over soon enough, and he could go back to Earth, back to his quiet life, back to where people didn't speak about him in the third person while he was standing right there. He reached Environmental Control Sector 7 and got to work. The climate regulators needed recalibration, a task that required both precision and strength, apparently a rare combination among the Council's preferred species. Jack methodically disassembled the panel, his hands working automatically while his mind wandered. Primitive, he muttered under his breath, adjusting the thermal compensator. You know what's primitive? A galactic civilization that still can't design a reliable heating system. The door hissed open, admitting Admiral Zorn Vex, the ship's commanding officer. The tall, gaunt alien barely acknowledged Jack's presence, speaking instead to his personal assistant. Ensure my quarters are prepared for the Strategic Council. We'll need refreshments for 17 high-ranking officers. Yes, Admiral, replied the assistant, a small green being with translucent skin who frantically tapped notes on a datapad. The Admiral's gaze finally fell on Jack. Ah, the human. I trust you're not damaging anything valuable. Just fixing your environmental controls, sir. Again. HM. Well, try not to exert yourself. I understand your species has limited cognitive capacity when engaged in physical labor. Jack smiled politely, thinking about his 2 PhDs gathering dust back home. I'll do my best to think and turn a wrench at the same time, Admiral. Vex didn't catch the sarcasm. Good, carry on. He swept from the room, his ceremonial cape billowing dramatically behind him. Jack sighed, tightening a connection. 6 months to go. At least the job itself was mindlessly simple. Fix the systems the advanced species couldn't be bothered to maintain properly. Stay quiet. Don't cause trouble. How hard could that be? 3 days later, Jack was elbow-deep in a ventilation shaft when the ship's alert system activated. Not the harsh, pulsing alarm of battle stations, but the more dignified, yet insistent tone that indicated urgent council business. "All command staff report to Strategic Planning Chamber," announced the ship's AI in a melodious voice. "Priority Alpha." "Repeat, all command staff to Strategic Planning Chamber." Jack continued working. Whatever crisis had emerged, it wouldn't involve a human maintenance technician. He had almost finished repairing the ventilation system when the doors slid open and Commander Flit rushed in, crest fully erect in agitation. "Human, what are you doing here?" Jack gestured to the open panel. "Fixing your air circulation. The tertiary loop was." "Never mind that," Flit interrupted. "We need this chamber for an emergency strategic council. The cleaning crew is unavailable, and someone must adjust the environmental controls for 17 different species. You'll have to do it." "Ishii, I'm not janitorial staff," Jack pointed out. "You're the only one available with the necessary physical capabilities," Flit said, already turning to leave. "Set the chamber for multi-species comfort and remain at the auxiliary control panel in case adjustments are needed." Before Jack could protest further, Flit was gone. With a sigh, Jack gathered his tools and moved to the small control alcove at the rear of the chamber. He'd just finished adjusting the atmospheric mix when the doors opened again. They entered like a procession of exotic birds, high-ranking officers from a dozen species, their uniforms adorned with insignia representing countless campaigns and honors. At their center walked an imposing figure that made even Jack pause, General Quivax of the Veltraxian hegemony. Even humans knew of Quivax, the foremost military historian and strategist in the galaxy, author of the definitive compendium of tactical excellence across 12 millennia, and advisor to the Galactic Council for over 2 centuries. His species resembled upright lizards with iridescent scales that shifted color with their emotions, currently a deep, serious purple. Admiral Vex took the central position at the circular table. "The situation is grave. The Horde has breached containment at Sector 87. A collective murmur of concern rippled through the assembly. Jack, forgotten in his alcove, listened with growing interest. The Horde, a mysterious collective of silicon-based life forms from beyond the galactic rim, had been pressing against Council territory for decades, but never before had they penetrated this deeply. "We have less than 3 standard cycles before they reach the Procyon colonies," continued Vex. "Billions of lives are at risk." General Quivax's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue-green. "Admiral, with your permission, I have analyzed the threat patterns and prepared a strategic response." "By all means, General." Quivax activated the holographic display at the center of the table. A 3-dimensional star map appeared, showing the positions of Council forces and the advancing Horde. The Horde employs the fragmented advance, a strategy documented in the wars of the ancient Pelcorians, over 9,000 years ago, Quivax explained with academic precision. They separate their forces into 17 smaller groups, each appearing to operate independently, yet maintaining perfect tactical cohesion. The general manipulated the display, showing complex formations and movement patterns. "To counter this, I propose the Unified Defense Doctrine, a strategy I developed based on the Triaxian conflict of the 43rd pre-Unity century." Jack, watching from his alcove, frowned slightly. The formations Quivax was describing looked oddly familiar, though not for the reasons the general was citing. "We will position our forces in a helical defense pattern, rotating our strongest assets through these key junction points," Quivax continued. "The elegance of this approach is that it appears as a standard defensive posture to the enemy, but contains within it the seeds of a devastating counterattack." The assembled officers nodded appreciatively, several making notes on their datapads. "I must note," Quivax added with a dismissive flick of his tail, "that we should avoid the crude approach that less developed species might suggest. Direct confrontation is the hallmark of primitive military thinking, the kind of brutish tactics favored by species from Deathworlds who have not yet evolved beyond their violent origins." Several officers glanced briefly toward Jack's alcove before quickly looking away. "Indeed," agreed Admiral Vex. "We must rely on sophisticated strategy rather than crude force." Jack remained silent, focusing on the environmental controls and trying not to listen too closely as Quivax continued his lecture on the superiority of evolved tactical thinking over primitive aggression. It wasn't his place to comment, after all. He was just there to make sure nobody suffocated if the life support systems decided to malfunction. Which, given their track record, seemed increasingly likely as the room filled with more hot air by the minute. 3 hours into the Strategic Council, Jack had adjusted the room temperature 14 times, modified the atmospheric composition twice, and fixed the holographic projector once when it stuttered during General Quivax's explanation of the 17 vectors of tactical superiority. Through it all, he remained in his corner, silently observing as the galaxy's premier military minds talked themselves in circles. The Horde continues to advance using the same pattern, reported Commander T. Prell, her multiple eyes blinking in frustration. Our predictive models suggested they would have shifted to a defensive posture by now. Perhaps they haven't recognized our counter-formation, suggested Admiral Vex. General Quivax, could they be employing a variation of the fragmented advance that doesn't appear in historical records? Quivax's scales rippled with indignation. Impossible. The compendium is comprehensive. They must be using a documented strategy. Jack rubbed his temples. This wasn't the first time he'd witnessed high-ranking officials stubbornly clinging to theory when reality refused to cooperate. It reminded him of faculty meetings back at the university, where professors would argue for hours about the correct interpretation of historical events while ignoring new evidence. Before being volunteered for the Human Integration Program, Jack had been Dr. John Hollis, tenured professor of military history and strategic studies at Oxford. His specialty? Analyzing how overconfidence in established doctrine led to military disasters throughout human history. He'd written 3 books on the subject, all bestsellers in academic circles. None of that mattered here, of course. To the Galactic Council, he was just another human, a curiosity from a deathworld whose species had only recently stopped killing each other long enough to look to the stars. We must commit to the unified defense doctrine, Quivax insisted, his scales now a determined orange. The formation must be perfect. Any deviation will compromise the strategic integrity. But General, ventured a timid officer from a species Jack couldn't identify. We've lost 2 destroyer groups attempting to maintain the pattern. The Horde seems to be anticipating our movements. Impossible. Quivax's tail lashed in agitation. They are silicon-based life forms. They cannot possibly comprehend the subtlety of our approach. Jack bit his lip. He recognized what was happening. The Horde wasn't using any ancient Pelcorian strategy. They were employing a simple pincer movement, exploiting the rigid formation the Council forces were maintaining. It was military strategy 101. If your enemy refuses to adapt, you don't need to either. The debate continued, growing more heated as reports arrived of additional Council ships lost. The elegant formations on the holographic display were beginning to look decidedly less elegant as gaps appeared where vessels had been destroyed. Perhaps, suggested Admiral Vex, looking increasingly desperate, we should consider a temporary tactical withdrawal to consolidate our forces. Retreat? Quivax's scales turned a shocked white. Inconceivable. The unified defense doctrine accounts for temporary setbacks. We must maintain formation. Jack watched the display, mentally calculating casualty rates. At the current pace, the Council fleet would be decimated within 12 hours, leaving the Procyon colonies defenseless. All because these advanced species couldn't recognize when their precious doctrine had failed. He should say nothing. This wasn't his fight. He was a maintenance technician, not a strategic advisor. His contract explicitly prohibited unsolicited intervention in Council affairs. Speaking up could get him shipped back to Earth in disgrace, possibly jeopardizing the entire human integration program. But billions of lives were at stake, real people or real aliens, anyway, who would die because some pompous historian couldn't admit his ancient tactics weren't working. Jack's internal debate was interrupted when the environmental control panel emitted a shrill alarm. The room's oxygen mix was fluctuating again. As he moved to correct it, his elbow knocked against a stack of datapads, sending them clattering to the floor. Every eye in the room turned toward him. "Is there a problem?" "Human?" Admiral Vex asked coldly. No, sir. Just a minor environmental adjustment. General Quivax's scales shifted to a contemptuous green. Perhaps the Deathworlder is uncomfortable with sophisticated strategic discussion. I understand humans still resolve many disputes through physical combat. A ripple of nervous laughter circulated through the chamber. Tell me, human, Quivax continued, clearly enjoying the diversion, what would your species do in this situation? Charge blindly at the enemy, guns blazing, as you say on Earth? Jack hesitated. This was his cue to apologize, fix the environmental controls, and fade back into the background. Instead, he looked directly at the holographic display showing the ongoing disaster, and remained silent. For exactly 6 seconds, Jack said nothing, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The silence stretched uncomfortably in the chamber as the assembled officers watched him, first with amusement, then with growing confusion. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and matter-of-fact. You're fighting the wrong war. General Quivax's scales flashed a startled yellow. Excuse me? Your unified defense doctrine is based on the assumption that the Horde is fighting a war of territorial conquest, Jack continued, stepping closer to the display. They're not. They're fighting a war of resource acquisition. He gestured to the holographic map. Look at their movement pattern. They're not trying to hold territory, they're creating extraction corridors. Admiral Vex frowned. That's absurd, the compendium clearly states. The compendium is wrong, Jack interrupted, earning gasps from several officers. Or rather, it's applying the wrong historical analogy. This isn't the fragmented advance from the Pelcorian Wars, it's much simpler. Jack reached for the controls of the holographic display. After a moment's hesitation, Admiral Vex nodded permission. Jack manipulated the interface, highlighting the Horde's movement patterns. This is a foraging pattern. They move in, strip an area of whatever resources they're after, then move on. Your defensive formation is actually helping them by remaining predictable and creating gaps they can exploit. Quivax's scales turned an outraged red. Preposterous. The unified defense doctrine is based on 12 millennia of military history. History is only useful if you're applying the right lessons, Jack replied. He grabbed a napkin from the refreshment table and a stylus from a nearby datapad. With quick, confident strokes, he sketched an alternative formation. Split your forces into 3 groups, 2 hunting packs to harass their flanks here, and a central force to protect the colonies. He circled key positions. Don't try to maintain a fixed formation. Let the hunting packs adapt to the Horde's movements, targeting their resource transports rather than their warships. The room had fallen completely silent as Jack continued sketching, adding annotations in Earth Standard that most couldn't read. But that's just a crude flanking maneuver, sputtered Quivax. A tactic so simple, it's taught to juvenile cadets. Sometimes simple works, Jack replied with a shrug, especially when your enemy has convinced themselves you're playing a more complicated game than you actually are. He handed the napkin to Admiral Vex, who stared at it with an unreadable expression. The Horde doesn't care about your elegant formations or historical precedents. They're after resources, not glory. Hit them where it hurts their bottom line, and they'll retreat. Commander Flitt's crest rose in alarm. Admiral, surely you're not considering tactical advice from a maintenance technician. Vex hesitated, looking from the increasingly desperate situation on the tactical display to the crude diagram on the napkin. What makes you think you understand this situation better than General Quivax, human? He asked finally. Jack sighed. No point hiding it now. Before I joined the Human Integration Program, I was a professor of military history specializing in strategic failures. My focus was on how over-reliance on established doctrine leads to defeat when facing adaptive opponents. A professor? Repeated T. Prell incredulously. But your file says... My file says what the integration program thought would get me assigned where I could be useful, Jack interrupted. Apparently, someone thought this ship needed a different perspective. General Quivax had recovered his composure, his scales now a contemptuous blue. Admiral, This is ridiculous. You cannot possibly consider abandoning a proven strategic doctrine in favor of this napkin sketch from a species that was fighting with gunpowder less than a millennium ago. Admiral Vex looked at the tactical display once more. 3 more Council ships had been lost in the time they'd been arguing. "General," he said quietly, "your proven doctrine is failing. We will implement the human suggestion." He turned to his communications officer. "Transmit these new orders to the fleet immediately." As the officer hurried to comply, Quivax's scales cycled through colors so rapidly that Jack worried the general might suffer some kind of seizure. "This is unprecedented. Unacceptable. I will file a formal protest with the Galactic Council." "File whatever you want," replied Vex, suddenly looking very tired. "But first, let's see if we can avoid losing this war." He turned to Jack. "Human Hollis, I believe your environmental control duties are concluded. Please remain available for strategic consultation." Jack nodded, trying not to smile at Quivax's expression of utter disbelief. 6 seconds of silence, and everything had changed. "They're doing what?" General Quivax's scales had settled on a horrified grey as he watched the tactical display. The Council fleet was no longer maintaining its elegant helical formation. Instead, the ships had broken into the 3 groups Jack had suggested: 2 aggressive hunting packs harassing the Horde's flanks and a central defensive force protecting the Procyon colonies. 6th Destroyer Group reports successful interception of a Horde resource transport, announced the communications officer. Enemy vessels are breaking off their advance to protect their supply line. Jack watched with satisfaction. His hypothesis had been correct. The Horde wasn't interested in territory or conquest. They wanted something specific, something they were extracting from conquered systems before moving on. "This is barbaric," muttered Quivax, watching as the Council ships executed their new orders. "No elegance, no historical precedent, just effectiveness," suggested Jack mildly. Admiral Vex studied the changing tactical situation with growing interest. The Horde formations are shifting. They appear to be consolidating their forces to protect their transports. As expected, Jack nodded. "Now we press the advantage. Order Hunting Pack Alpha to target this junction." He pointed to a spot where several Horde supply ships were converging. "That's likely their collection point. Hit it hard enough, and they'll have to decide whether this resource grab is worth the cost." Commander T. Prell's multiple eyes blinked rapidly. "But that would violate the 3rd principle of the consolidated warfare ethic. We never target non-military vessels. Those transports are carrying stolen resources from Council worlds," Jack pointed out. "They're legitimate military targets. But the ethic clearly states." "The ethic was written by species who never had to fight on Deathworlds," Jack interrupted. "On Earth, we learned that sometimes you have to be pragmatic to survive." Quivax's scales darkened further. "Pragmatic, is that what you call it? This is precisely the brutish thinking I referenced. No respect for tradition. No appreciation for the established rules of warfare." "Rules of warfare," Jack repeated, unable to keep the sarcasm from his voice. "I'm sure the civilians on the Procyon colonies will be comforted knowing their defenders followed all the proper rules while failing to save them." "How dare!" "Hunting Pack Alpha has engaged the Horde collection point," interrupted the tactical officer. "Multiple enemy transports disabled. The Horde warships are breaking formation to respond." The display showed the Horde forces frantically reorganizing, pulling ships from their advance to protect their vulnerable transports. "Now order Hunting Pack Beta to hit their exposed flank," Jack suggested. "Don't try to destroy their warships, just keep them off balance while they're distracted." Admiral Vex nodded to the communications officer, who transmitted the orders. "This is chaos," Quivax complained, his tail lashing in agitation. "Pure, undisciplined chaos." "Uncontrolled chaos," Jack corrected. "Sometimes the best way to deal with an orderly enemy is to introduce a little disorder." The tactical display updated continuously as the battle unfolded. The Horde forces, once advancing in their methodical pattern, were now scattered, reacting to threats on multiple fronts. Their previously inexorable progress toward the Procyon colonies had stalled. Admiral, reported the communications officer. Hunting Pack Beta reports the Horde vessels are abandoning their damaged transports and regrouping. They're cutting their losses, Jack observed. The resources aren't worth the fight anymore. General Quivax had fallen silent, his scales a mottled pattern of disbelief and outrage as he watched Jack's primitive strategy unravel his carefully constructed doctrine in real time. I cannot believe we are witnessing this, he finally said, voice trembling. Centuries of tactical development, abandoned for this. For winning, Admiral Vex corrected, a new respect in his voice as he looked at Jack. Sometimes the old ways aren't the best ways, General. If this works, Quivax warned, it will undermine the entire foundation of Council military doctrine. Every species will think they can simply improvise strategy without proper historical context. Jack shrugged. Sometimes improvisation beats doctrine. That's a lesson from Earth's history. A lesson from a death world, muttered Quivax. What could such a place possibly teach the civilized galaxy about warfare? As if in answer, the tactical display updated once more. The Horde forces were in full retreat, abandoning their resource transports and withdrawing from Council space. It appears, said Admiral Vex dryly, that Deathworlders might know something about survival after all. The aftermath of the battle found the strategic chamber considerably more crowded than before. News of the unexpected victory had spread quickly, and officers who had been dismissive of the human maintenance technician now found pressing reasons to visit Environmental Control Sector 7. 317 vessels saved, reported Commander Flitt, his crest raised in what Jack now recognized as excitement rather than alarm. The Horde has withdrawn completely from Sector 87. Admiral Vex nodded, scanning the latest reports. And the Procyon colonies are secure. A remarkable outcome. Most remarkable, agreed Quivax stiffly, his scales a subdued grey-blue. The general had spent the last hour in sullen silence, watching as his carefully constructed doctrine was dismantled and replaced by what he persisted in calling primitive opportunism. Jack remained in his corner, uncomfortable with the attention now directed his way. He hadn't signed up for this. All he'd wanted was to complete his assignment and return to Earth, preferably without causing an interstellar incident. Human Hollis, said Admiral Vex formally, the Council owes you a debt of gratitude. Just doing my job. Admiral, Jack replied automatically. Your job was environmental maintenance, T. Prell pointed out, her multiple eyes blinking in what might have been amusement. Not rewriting our entire tactical doctrine. About that, interjected a new voice. A small, officious-looking alien entered the chamber, carrying what appeared to be an ornate scroll. I bring a direct communication from the High Council. The room fell silent as the messenger cleared his throat dramatically and began to read. In recognition of unexpected tactical innovation and service to the galactic community, human John Hollis is hereby elevated to the position of strategic consultant to the Council forces, with all attendant privileges and responsibilities. Jack blinked. I'm sorry, what? You're being promoted, translated Admiral Vex, quite significantly, in fact. But I'm supposed to return to Earth in 6 months. The messenger continued reading. Furthermore, human Hollis will collaborate with General Quivax of the Veltraxian hegemony on a comprehensive update to the Compendium of Tactical Excellence, incorporating Deathworld perspectives on strategic theory. Quivax's scales turned an alarming shade of purple. This is an excellent opportunity for knowledge exchange, finished Admiral Vex smoothly. Wouldn't you agree, General? Quivax's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed a tight nod. Of course. Knowledge exchange. Jack looked from the messenger to Quivax to Admiral Vex. I don't understand. Yesterday I was fixing ventilation systems. Today I'm co-authoring the galaxy's premier military textbook. The Council moves in mysterious ways, Vex said dryly, but they recognize value when they see it, even if it comes from unexpected sources. As the implications sank in, Jack realized his quiet plan to serve out his time and return to Earth had just evaporated. Instead, he faced the prospect of months, perhaps years, working alongside a pompous historian who clearly despised him and everything he represented. "What if I decline?" he asked cautiously. The messenger looked scandalized. "Decline? One does not decline a council appointment. The honor is, it's unprecedented." Jack sighed. "So I don't have a choice." "You always have choices, human Hollis," said Admiral Vex quietly. "But consider this, your perspective saved countless lives today. How many more might be saved if the Council's forces learned to think differently?" Put that way, Jack found it hard to argue. Still, the thought of working with Quivax was hardly appealing. "I suppose I could give it a try," he conceded. "Excellent." The messenger presented the scroll with a flourish. "Your new quarters are being prepared as we speak, and much more suitable for a being of your new status." "Will they have a better environmental control system?" Jack asked hopefully. "The best in the fleet," promised Admiral Vex. "After all, we can't have our new strategic consultant fixing his own ventilation, can we?" As the chamber erupted in polite laughter, Jack caught Quivax's eye. The general's scales had settled into a pattern Jack hadn't seen before, a mixture of resignation, curiosity, and perhaps the faintest hint of respect. "I look forward to our collaboration, human Hollis," Quivax said stiffly. "Though I warn you, I shall not allow mere pragmatism to overshadow 12 millennia of tactical wisdom." Jack smiled. "And I won't let 12 millennia of tactical wisdom overshadow common sense. Deal?" After a moment's hesitation, Quivax extended a scaled hand. "A deal." As they shook hands, Quivax rather gingerly, as if afraid Jack's Deathworld strength might crush his fingers, Jack reflected on the strange turn his assignment had taken. 6 months had become who knew how long. Fixing ventilation systems had become rewriting military doctrine. And somewhere along the way, a primitive Deathworlder had earned a begrudging place at the table with the galaxy's elite. All because he'd remained silent for 6 seconds, then spoken his mind. Not bad for a maintenance technician. Or a professor, for that matter.